begin the program today, and it's being presented by Paul Gerkian on the topic Appropriate Metrics for Security Governance. So this is a brief outline of the program for tonight. We should have started 6:30, so we'll be running a bit late, and we will hand over the presentation to Paul from, I think, 10 minutes after this introductory presentation. Then around 7:30 or 7:40, Paul will end his presentation. That will be followed by Q&A section where networking and refreshment for the attendees will take place. At approximately 8:30, the program will close tonight. Okay, thank you so much and welcome back. So the Chartered Institute for IT, known as BCS, is the British Computer Science Society, which currently have about 75,000 members located in 150 countries. And within the UK, there are about 50 branches, and we have 11 overseas sections. There are 65 specialist groups within it, and BCS, which I indicated earlier, is a membership organization. So if anyone who is attending today is interested in joining and you are not a member, and as long as you enjoy this event, please consider trying to join us. You'll be very much welcome. You will receive access to many exclusive career development tools, an introduction to thriving professional community, and also help us make IT good for society in case you join. So try and join us. After this, you can contact myself or John or Andy if we finish this program and you are interested in joining. And now brief story and information about IRMA SG. It simply means Information Risk Management and Assurance Specialist Group. It is incorporated within the BCS, and this was done in 1965. And it will interest you to know that it's the second oldest SG within the BCS group. We currently have about 1,002 members in over 200 overseas members. We encourage research into risk management for information system, and also I've lost the other slide, but because of time, I will just move on to the this evening event, which is being presented by Paul. And Paul is known to be a pragmatic speaker, and he has a wealth of experience in the cyber risk domain, blended with academic research. And his main focus is to help organizations understand how to use cyber metrics wisely, how to design a cyber metrics model, and how to identify the vital few versus vital many cyber metrics, and how many cyber metrics can drive continuous improvement and support other parts of the security program and engagement.
Thank you very much, everyone, and welcome to everyone online as well, of course. I can't see you in any way, so I don't know how many or how few you are, but I understand there's quite a few people online as well as here today. So thanks very much for taking your time to listen to me. I hope I can provide you with some kind of interesting and pragmatic insights into the journey around security risk and metrics. So so at the moment I'm a PhD researcher. I'm looking at security metrics as my specialist subject, and also doing things like risk models around cyber risk. I've been involved actually in the British Computer Society quite a bit. I knew John about 10 years ago and was, I think, chairman of the IRMA for a bit, about 10 years ago. So yeah, I love coming to talk here. So I guess, one of the things we need to consider tonight is just how complex cyber risk is. it is not an easy topic, as someone who's just spent the last 3 years trying to come up with a research thesis with the help of John, actually. So it's not an easy topic at all to get into. And these are just some of the, summary of some of the challenges that might be faced. Cyber is very unique. I am currently working at Lloyd's of London as their Business Information Security Officer, and they're affording me a great deal of opportunity to research into this area. There's very few other parts, if you think of cyber insurance, there's very few areas that are genuinely global in nature. So if you have a hurricane in the Caribbean, it's unlikely you're having a hurricane in London at the same time. So you can segment your risk, spread it out. You can't really do that with cyber. Such a dominance of some of the big players, such as Microsoft, Google, so on. They're just so dominant that they're just everywhere. So, cyber is one of those few industries genuinely global. And has a huge amount of systemic risk built into it just by that nature of being global, being standardized. Everyone knows what Microsoft technology is, so therefore they can study it and then attack it. So it's not easy to defend because the attacker has just as much knowledge as you have about what you're running, and sometimes in some cases more knowledge than you have of what you're running or not. It's very dynamic. They say that 40% of the assistant ATPs are responsible for, the top 10 ATPs are responsible for 40% of cyber attacks in the world. So, there is a concentration risk on both sides, both from the attackers and from the defenders. Everything is a bit fragmented, uncertain. The internet is genuinely open, so anyone who can basically rent a server for £1 and attack you. So, it's a very low cost of barrier to entry and so on. So I don't need to convince anyone in the room of that. So, and there are lots of unintended consequences of security. So we saw this with AWS as it rolled out containers. They, kind of started getting attacked, and then they got a bit clever, and then they realized, they're changing their attack vectors, so they have to keep responding to it. And that's, when you implement security, sometimes you create other holes. So there's this kind of wicked problem of, as soon as we fix one issue, we suddenly reveal another issue. And we see this with multi-factor authentication, for example, where, we thought it was pretty good, and how could you get around that? And then they find a way. So, it is a difficult problem. So one of the things I've found, I spent about 3 years as a CISO, is what was really interesting in moving from more of a technical role up to a more senior role is just who you're talking to on the board and sometimes how little they know and sometimes how much they know. Some of them are absolutely fascinated by the topic, but they're almost kind of dangerous in that they know a little about it and they don't know a lot. So, it can be a very difficult role, especially in those senior leadership roles in security, to drive forward a whole organization to really get that security culture right, because so many people have opinions on security. So part of the data journey is to try and remove some of the opinions from the journey and try to actually get to data-driven decisions. So that was what inspired me to start doing a PhD in security metrics. As I was sitting as a CISO, basically there's a lot of people talking nonsense about security, and I was like, I wish I had some data to show them what they're talking about, because they don't really understand it, and I really could use data here. I could use a dashboard to really help me, and that's when I started developing dashboards to help me drive home my message to kind of the board level type people, to really kind of create a structure on which we could build, because it was all very opinion based and kind of subjective up to that point. So I won't bore you with all going through all of the different ones, but obviously the human dimension can't be avoided. So the human dimension potentially is the kind of the unknown parameter. It can either be your best defense or it could be your greatest weakness. So it just depends on how you use it. I think there's a really good lesson in correlation versus causation there. So there's often a statistic I love to see go around LinkedIn, which says 85% of incidents are caused by people. There's a partial truth in that, but the reality is, 100% of road accidents happen on the road. If you want to find correlation, you'll find it. But really what we're here about looking for causation, and that's what I really want to try and achieve with security metrics, is actually to try and find causes, not just correlations. Correlations are interesting, but causes are more beneficial to people who are trying to resolve the issues. So what I noticed in my current environment, and I worked in financial services, so I worked for Prudential, RBS, some of the big four. is that essentially the UK financial services industry has been stuck about 3.4, if you're familiar with the capability maturity scale, been stuck on about 3.2, 3.4 for about 10 or so years now. So we really haven't made, if we're to use this scale as a measurement of success, and that could be debated, then we have been stuck. Basically, we've not made any material progress in the last few years. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is because we've kind of, I suppose, used up the tools that we've got. So the tools we have are really around driving more process and maybe more audits, more testing. So we're starting to use up those tools, and we can't really get much beyond. And if you think about trying to work out a score, you probably have a couple of 4s in there and a couple of 2s, and you'll average out in the middle of the 3s. That's kind of what tends to happen. So really what we need is a couple of those controls to rise up to 4 and 5 to raise the average. So we really need the key controls to really lift themselves in order to drag up that average to represent a higher maturity. So we see these improvements, for example, in things like the airline industry. So the airline industry have a fantastic safety record of driving improvement continuously, because they will micro-investigate every incident that occurs, and that really drives that safety culture and improvement around there. And they have a very strong safety culture, of course, around the airline industry. So, we can see other industries that are modeling this for us as a cyber, which is relatively young as an industry, and we can use the kind of experience that they've had in developing their methodologies and models to drive cyber, actually. And that's something I've looked into. And the airline industry is probably the best example of that, really driving home the safety message, if we're to kind of use that as a parallel. So quantitatively managed, as I suggest, is about metrics, about measurements, about controls. So by implementing metrics models, we are inevitably lifting ourselves in towards that 4. I'm not going to make any promises of how far up you're going to get, but you're definitely going to move up. And if you're to follow this methodology, then you can't really move further up without doing metrics and measurements. So inevitably you get pointed in there. And I would like to see us certainly floating around the ends of the 3 point something up into 4 would be nice. And that probably mean we'll need to hit 5 at some point. But today we'll focus on the quantitatively managed element of it. So one of my kind of favorite models is the FAIR risk model, a measurement of risk. So this is about quantifying risk, and this is there's a really good FAIR institute that does a talk about once a quarter in the UK, and they present people who have implemented this. We are trying to do so at Lloyd's in my role. We're trying to move to kind of cyber risk quantification, those kind of more quantitative side of things. We're not there yet, but we're on a roadmap towards more risk quantification. So that's freely available online, so I won't overdwell on that. But I think what we're looking at really is something around frequency, vulnerability, and then they have this concept of primary loss and secondary loss. So a lot of, if you look at the IBM data breaches report, you'll see actually a lot of your costs are secondary costs. So actually the cost of actually responding to the incidents and fixing the computers is probably only about a third of the actual cost. The other third, roughly speaking, comes from the actual incident response team that you have to get, the PR people, the lawyers, the specialists that you have to put out, may or may not be insured for that. And then the other is your data compliance, so your GDPR fines, those kind of things that come out the back end. So really recommend the IBM data breaches report as a really good insight into, they do a kind of cost model, obviously for bigger, it tends to focus on bigger financial type companies in America, but nonetheless it's still a good model for how to look at this. So when we did our cyber risk quantification for a number of insurance companies, what I was surprised to learn was actually we can only affect, so roughly speaking, we had something like £6 million of risk exposure, and with all our controls we brought that down to 1.5. And even if we got 5 scores across, like we got that perfect score on the CMMI, we'd still only bring it down to about £1 million, give or take. So when you look at that, there's almost like an inherent risk, and I would kind of maybe attribute that to the systemic risk of just using a computer. There's just an inherent risk of being out there. Even if you did the best job in the world, you're still carrying, you could probably reduce your risk by maybe 80 or 90%, but you can't get rid of it because you're working with third parties, you're not controlling them. No matter how many questionnaires they send them, you're still not controlling them. You're not even controlling your own world. People are deploying things all the time, making changes. So, and even if you think about patching, there's a lag time between, getting notification and actually applying. So there's always gaps. So the goal is not to really achieve 100%. The goal is to find a sensible level of cadence that you can sustain over time, and essentially, move away from this 100% protection to more 100% resilience. So what I mean by resilience is you're almost allowing, or you're prepared to allow a certain number of things to come through because you're not going to invest, £100 billion on permanent security. And even if you did, you just tamper your whole business anyway. So there's a kind of a point of diminishing returns on your investment around protection. So then obviously you switch then to recovery and resilience, like how can you fail over, can you recover? So actually what we're finding in my journey so far is there's a more of a switch now from the defend methodology to the resilience and recovery being just as important as the defend. We're going to assume failure on the defense at some point, and we're going to actually focus on the other side of the equation and recover quickly so that there's minimal impact, and then have a sensible amount of investment in protection, but also equal and sensible amount of investment in resilience and recovery. I think when I was started about 15 or 20 years ago, the resilience and recovery bit did suffer a bit. It was lagging to the protection. Everyone kind of came out and decided to protect everything, and if we protect everything, then we won't fail. But now we just know we're wiser because we know we can't defend everything, so we're now moving to the protection side of it. So I think the FAIR methodology is really interesting. It calls out a number of things, and it forces you to be a little bit more kind of mathematical, quantified about things. So here's the bit where I hope to get your participation. So I'm just really interested in why you bought your last car. If you're buying a car, what car would you buy? So I'm going to want to... What's your buying criteria when you're purchasing a car? Most people have purchased a car in their life, or at least thought about purchasing a car. What would be your criteria?
Cost.
Cost, okay. Yeah. Anything else?
Safety. Reliability.
Say again?
Reliability.
Reliability. Okay, that's really good one.
Safety.
Safety, yeah. Okay. Any other?
Capacity.
Capacity, yeah. Great.
The brand.
Brand. Okay. So, these are really, really good points, right? So, what we would find is if we tried to put some metrics on buying a car, so we talked about reliability, so what metric would represent reliability for you in a car?
Sometimes it breaks down.
And how would you know that?
Past data or manufacturer's quality standards.
Yeah, so you're going to look for reference data around it, and again, you mentioned brand. So some brands have a good reputation that they make good cars. So we're kind of implicit in the brand is the trust of reliability, right? You mentioned cost, I think. Mm-hmm. So you're probably maybe not buying the one on the bottom right. Can't work out if it's a Ferrari or Lamborghini, but something very expensive. yeah, that is your car, isn't it? Yeah, so we have Lada's the cheapest car, right? So if it's only on price, have you ever bought a Lada? So it's not just price, but you are price sensitive, right? So you're not just buying the cheapest car you can find, you're buying perhaps the Ford Focus, a really good value, middle of the road, value for money, as you might say. We have smart cars that may be more practical around London just because of parking and so on. To John's point, you might need a bigger car for more people. You might want an electric car because your values are basically you're interested in the environment and you think buying an electrical car will help that, right? And then you might want a status symbol, right? You might want to impress somebody. You might just have a load of money and want to spend it, right? Whatever your reason. So, the reason I show this is because I don't think if we spent the next hour talking about buying a car, we could probably agree on the metrics, the best metrics to buy a car.
Value retention.
Say again?
Value retention.
Value retention, yeah, it's a great one, yeah. So, the point is that metrics are not all the answers. There's still a huge amount of emotion involved in these decisions. No matter how many, fact sheets we get out, you'll still probably make the decision quite emotionally. You might prefer a color, you might prefer a size, a shape, something you drove before because it's familiar, So the point I'm making is that quantification and kind of hard numbers are not going to answer all questions, but we can probably narrow down the number of options that we want to choose based on, for example, a price filter on the website will then narrow down the choice of cars, maybe a color choice, and now you're down to 12 or 50. Now you're down to a sensible number of things that you can manage, and you can make a choice from there. And some things don't really matter. At the end of the day, they all have four wheels, they all have engines, they will all get you from A to B. So does it really matter what one you choose? It's still quite a subjective choice when you do it at the end of the day. So, numbers aren't everything, but they do matter, and they do help you make decisions, and they're good for filtering down the amount of data that you have to look at. So that's the real point I'm making here. So I guess when, I told the story of kind of arriving as my first CISO role and arriving in this boardroom, and of course, most of them have been there 20 years, knew the company inside out, and here's little old me trying to get them to give me £1 million to do some work. And, what I really lacked, and what I realized I lacked, I understood the environment, but they didn't see the environment the way I saw it. I saw it as a set of systems and IT systems with risks, and I was aware of what the risks were, but they were not aware of what the risks were. So they couldn't see the faulty brakes, the oil leaks. They said, well, so what? It's an oil leak, we're still going from A to B, aren't we? So I guess, what I like about metrics is hopefully it will bring people to agreeing on facts. And what I found when I started to present data was that we could all agree what the data was, that the data was broadly accurate. And once we did that, we found it much easier to make decisions. The decisions happen much quicker. Well, of course you want to patch the server that has 100 critical vulnerabilities that's running our multi-million-pound system. That seems like a good idea, Paul, off you go. Oh, and you'd like 100 grand for that? Oh, no problem. Yeah, there was no issue with getting money to fix things once I showed them what they were. So rather than saying, oh, I think there's a risk over there, that really didn't kind of wash. So, becoming more fact-based really helped me to communicate what I was trying to do. And also it was easier then to show evidence that you had achieved it. So when they gave me £1 million, I gave them the report at the end of the year, and it happened there was 10 kind of red or amber lights at the beginning of the year, and maybe there's only couple of ambers and all were green at the end of the year, and like, well done, Paul, you've done a great job. So I was able to kind of almost tell a story with data to show them the progress we're making. So that I found really good. So what metric do you think has been shown here on the screen?
Height.
Okay.
Height.
Yeah, so the obvious thing would be height, because Tom Cruise is known for being a bit short, despite the fact that he wears some higher shoes, and Arnie is known for being quite tall, right? So it's a trick question, because there's no actual metric being shown there. There is a measurement of height being shown there, and it comes down to this kind of academic nuance that we make really around how we measure things. So measurements tend to be 1,000 vulnerabilities. A metric is really where we start to create relationships between those numbers. So we start to, what does 1,000 vulnerabilities mean anyway? Like, if you think about it, like, how do you, when you go to the board and say, we have 1,000 vulnerabilities, they're like, oh, I've got 1,000 problems. What do you want me to do about it, right? So, but if you say, 90% of our servers have a critical vulnerability, that sounds pretty bad to me. Do you want to go do something about it? So, being able to relate things to each other really helps to measure. And what I noticed as I kind of came to more C-level reporting was they love a benchmark. They absolutely adore a benchmark. See lots of nods around the room. Because like, what do these numbers mean anyway? It's a bit like the 3.2 on the maturity scale. Like, so what? Like, is it good? Is it bad? Like, how are we doing? Okay, well, all our peers are 3.7. Okay, well, I better hurry up then and get there, right? So, that's kind of how it works, really. And it's a little bit of a league table. And actually, league tables are one of my tricks that I use as a business. So if you want to motivate a senior manager, there's nothing more motivating to them than telling them they're in the bottom quartile of your league table, because they wouldn't be leaders unless they were competitive, and nobody wants to be in the bottom of the league. No one wants to be Luton Town in the Premiership or whatever. So they're naturally competitive people, so that is a great motivating factor, and it's a great way to use metrics to drive behaviours, is to create some league tables between different departments and functions to drive it. So I guess the point is that when I talk about metrics, I'm really talking about not really just measuring everything as in a measurement, but actually trying to kind of quantify it or qualify it in some way so that it brings meaning to the number itself and helps you to communicate what that number means. At the end of the day, we're looking for, in my world, quantifiable measures used to assess and communicate various aspects of the cyber security posture. And I think when I turn up with dashboards, I always see, especially if you go into an organization that's relatively immature, they genuinely love seeing the story told in a dashboard, because it's just so much easier to understand than they don't know whether to believe anyone, particularly in the beginning if you're in your first 3 months. But if you just pull the numbers from the system, then that's a great place to start. The other point I would make is if you're starting your metrics journey, when you report the first time, you'll report some pretty horrible metrics. I'm not going to lie to you. They'll just be a mess. And there's a bit of a kind of a journey, which I'll go through in a minute, around metrics. So when you first do it, the problem is that nobody's ever looked at the data. If you've ever done an API query and pulled a load of data from a system, nobody's ever looked at the metrics like that before. So they're probably a bit messy and untidy, and nobody's really organized them into nice groups so they mean something. So that first kind of data tidying phase will really help. But the way I look at it is your risk isn't any better or worse just because you got a bad set of numbers tomorrow because you ran a metrics or you're starting a metrics project. Your risk is still the same. Now you've just got a benchmark to base again. So for my money, the first thing I say to all the technical people is whatever these numbers are, and however good or bad you think they are, they're just the starting point. All we're going to do is improve from them. So I tend not to focus on the number itself, but rather on the improvement we can make to that number. That's, it's a better culture to have. Otherwise, people think you're getting metrics to beat them over the head with, especially if you've got an engineering team who's flat out, maybe a bit stressed, already overworked, and you're turning up telling them how bad they are. Like, oh no, we've been understaffed for years or whatever. So, what we're trying to do is to try and help them find what I call the vital few things that really move the metrics. So I've done this a number of times around vulnerability management. It's a pure data science project. It's lovely. You can find, quick wins that really reduce the amount of vulnerabilities that are exposed. And that then the engineering teams get excited about, oh, this data science guy can really help me to understand my numbers and actually help me get results quicker. Now you're alongside them, helping them, rather than just being more of a stick with some sort of dashboard that you've come up with. So, you really want to try and get your stakeholders engaged in the numbers and what the journey is, rather than, just reporting bad numbers to the board and not using it to help the teams to understand what then drives those numbers and what they can do, quick wins they can do to improve the numbers. So, okay, so there are lots of uses to metrics. I don't think I'll spend too long here because, I think a lot of it's pretty obvious, but clearly you got some sort of KPIs, like a performance type metric. You've got some sort of KRIs, key risk indicators that are more risk-based. And I'll show you some examples at the end of how I've done this. For compliance monitoring, it's always a good idea. So for example, DORA is coming up, and we've got a whole dashboard I'm building at the moment for DORA. So all the DORA reporting, I'm automating it, so we don't have to spend any time basically producing it. It will be a self-service dashboard to the people who need to consume it. That's our kind of North Star. It's going to take probably 6 or 12 months to get there. But it's well worth it in my opinion. At the moment, we're spending about a day a month just pulling metrics together and just pulling Excel spreadsheets and then trying to produce reports. And and they're quite inconsistent, whereas automated API-driven metrics straight into a Power BI dashboard, do that whole day. So plus what we can get there is a lot more trending and other nuances that are helpful. Incident response improvements. So the big problem with incident response in our company is we're so bloody good, we don't have many incidents. So we actually only have maybe 5 serious investigations every quarter, like really tiny, considering the size and shape we are. So, the statistical significance of one more, it's a 20% jump in incidents. We had one more, So you have to be really careful with small numbers because you get this kind of skewness in the data. Incident response improvements is great. But what I try to do is I try to look for the root cause behind the incident. So there's so few. So, well, what metric would help me what I call a leading indicator of risk. So what metric would have helped me to understand that that might have happened in the future, and what would have, if obviously we've caught them at this point, because but obviously looking for anything we might not have caught, and also looking at things like timeliness. So, you know, it might have taken 2 or 3 days to realize there was something going on. You know, how could we speed that up? So we can look behind the metrics, see what's happening there. Resource allocation is really important. So I've been kind of proactively driving all our work onto Jira boards to get measured and managed there. And we actually do a dashboard off the Jira system to drive that. I think one of the things that really undermines security teams is context switching. So again, I'm not a psychologist, but if you context switch a lot, you lose about 40% of your, or up to 40%, somewhere between 20 and 40% of your team's efforts you lose to context switching. So if they're constantly chopping and changing between things, what you'll find is you just have you're losing 1 day a week essentially to this context switching all the time. So what we really want to do is to try and optimize for sprints, you know, that you do a kind of a waves of things together and try to cluster things logically together so that they're done in a more kind of aligned way. And also the other thing I'm a big fan of is finding out the change cycle in the technology team. So when I was a CISO, well, the first thing I would do is say, when do you make changes? Oh, we make them every 3 months. Oh, good, because every 3 months I'm going to have a list of things for you to do. So now what I'm doing is aligning. So instead of getting them to stop for me, I'm finding out what they're doing anyway and just adding my security work to their pile and saying, well, you're making a change anyway, why don't you, you're going to be testing the system, you're going to be absorbing all these overheads and making changes, why don't you add in the security bits to that? And then the other concept that we have, which I think is really good, is that we have a cyber week. So we stop all of their IT changes, we do all of our changes in 1 week. And we achieve roughly, I think, somewhere between 40 and 50% of our improvements in that week. It's phenomenally beneficial. So again, it may not work everywhere, but there'll always be a week of downtime. It might be Christmas, it might be the end of August, whatever. There are natural lag times in these change cycles, but it's good to grab at least 1 week a year where you can really put security front and center of what you need to do and really prioritize that. And again, it comes down to this kind of context switching. So instead of the teams having 100 other things on their plate, they've got one objective for the week and you're controlling that, which is a really good thing to do. And then obviously the benefit of numbers is communication with stakeholders. And I used to report into the head of legal, who would be the first to admit she didn't have a single technical bone in her body. But once you show them a trend, directors can do trends all day, right? The trend's going up. Well, okay, that's great news. Well done, Paul. Carry on. The trend's going down. What the hell? But it was easy for her. She goes, I can finally talk to you. I don't have to know all the detail of what that is, but I can see the good trends and the bad trends, right? And you can tell me a story around that, and then we can work together to solve for it. And once we see, in the case of asking for money or resources or prioritization, then we can now see, oh, the numbers are switching, and we see them. So there's a feedback loop going on, which really becomes affirmative to trying to drive change in an organization. So if they can see that benefit pretty quickly in their numbers, they're like, oh, that's really good. So for example, if you do phishing awareness training and then you run your next test and your phishing performance has, where's performance jumped up, you say, okay, the more training we do, the more thing it is. And then you kind of say, oh, we do a few more. Actually, you're getting marginal gain over here. It's like, okay, so once a quarter is enough to drive that number. And you start to see the relationships between what you're doing and how often, and you find that optimal level where you can, instead of overtraining or undertraining, you're trying to find that optimal level that's within your risk tolerance. So it really helps those kind of conversations. Okay, so how long have I got? To about 7:30? Yeah. So I just wanted to kind of mention the different ways. So clearly, this is probably what most of you are using today, some sort of traditional risk management system, your 5x5 grid type thing. I don't think it's good or bad. I just think it's not complete in the sense of, if we look at the FAIR methodology, we will probably want to try to quantify, how many there, maybe what the trend is over time. And also, I think a really important thing when we're reporting is to look at context. So the critical vulnerability in your DMZ is far worse than a critical vulnerability in the machine that's in the office and not plugged into anything, because who cares, right? So there's extremes, but you get the idea that you want to kind of identify what these vital few things that you're really interested in, And I think you really need to kind of introduce a mixture of qualitative things and quantitative things. I don't think it's quantitative is all the answer. I think it just enhances other things when you blend them together properly. And some things are just more quantifiable than others. You know, vulnerability management, as I say, is a really good data science project. You can do numbers on it all day long. But there is also, you know, an element of risk, like, you know, is it on critical systems underpinning, you know, multi-million-pound businesses? Obviously, it really changes the profile of that one vulnerability versus. But really coming back to, like, how exploitable is it anyway? You know, it's quite a theoretical concept. Any individual exploitation is actually really low risk. Like in our organization, we've measured it at like 1 in 5 billion. So we'll get 5 billion event logs for every one actual real event that's coming through, given our current security posture. So you really are looking at very tiny risks, but nonetheless, they are there. And that's one of the challenges with measuring cybersecurity. You're really kind of measuring these black swan type events that are really rare. Although we see it in the news every day, when you know, but if you're unlucky, I worked at a company that was being targeted by very nation-state actors, and the incidents were quite regularly, like daily. So, you know, you can be unlucky, you can be the target of attacks. But in the main, if you're just a normal company out in the world, you're probably not being subject to it. But if you make yourself look like an easy target, you will start attracting more people. So, you know, it is a game of probably not being the lowest hanging fruit sometimes. Okay, so I'm a really, really big fan of quality management theory. I don't think we use enough of it in cybersecurity management. It is, ultimately, cyber is a quality problem. And what I mean by quality is security doesn't exist on its own, if you think about it. You know, if you remove the computer, you have no security, requirement for security. So why do we have a separate department for cyber security? Because it doesn't exist on its own. It exists as a property of other things. So if you've got a firewall has security. If you've got a server, the server has community. And of course, there are principles, and that's we've all spent time studying and doing all the exams, as I have over the years, you know, learning about this. But when you really think about it, you know, security is a property of the systems. So you can't really do security out of context. It has to be in context, because there is no other security out of context. It doesn't exist, which is why security is one of these wicked problems, because every time you change the system, you can't just apply the same old, you can apply the principles, but you have to then tailor it to what you've actually got there. So, you know, that was the biggest breakthrough that I made during my studies, was, you know, that the cyber is kind of not this other thing that we need to study. It's inherent in the properties of what we're actually trying to do, which is why, you know, CISOs need to get quite close to their business. What is the business trying to achieve? You know, resilience is way more important to the board than security. They actually not worry about security. They expect security to fail occasionally. Resilience, they don't want any failure there. So, you know, the language changes as soon as you get into the business side of your job. In the IT world, we talk a lot about protection and defending, which is great and it's important, but ultimately it's down to resilience. So, but what I noticed here, for example, and again, vulnerability management is a classic thing. So the way that I do vulnerability management, for example, just to give you I look for the top 10 things. So I look for the top 10 vulnerabilities that are out there. And generally they fall into a couple of categories. They'll either be operating system type things, your Windows patches, or there'll be some of these kind of add-on applications. So your 7-zips, your Adobes, you know, all of these things. And what you'll discover very quickly is obviously Windows Update is updating, you know, the Windows side of things. But what's updating 7-zip, Adobe, all these add-ons, right? What's managing that? And suddenly you realize, oh, actually, you know, TeamViewer or Zoom, for example, was a classic. We don't use Zoom in our company, but all our clients do. So every time we join a Zoom call, it downloads the client. Now we've got a whole bunch of vulnerable Zoom clients sitting on our thing because everyone's downloaded them and done a self-runnable install, right? So you have to kind of, you know, so when we did this report, we started saying, well, why is Zoom agents out there? We don't use Zoom, right? So, you know, we suddenly had all these vulnerabilities around Zoom. So by picking the top 10, then we realized, well, whether we like it or not, we're Zoom users. So let's just take control of that and manage it. So what you'll find is as you clear the top 5 or 10 things, all of a sudden, what happened in the data was the data became quite structured. So we started to see every time we ran a patch cycle, we'd see 200 servers move forward and have maybe 20 vulnerabilities outstanding or whatever the residual was. And the next month they move forward again, and they'd almost start moving in these blocks. You could start to see the data become very structured. But in the beginning it was quite noisy. So clearing out these vital few things will really help you structure your data. I'm conscious of time, so I won't spend too long. I do want to say one thing about averages. I hate averages. Averages are the bane of my life. There's a very good reason for that, because averages tell you very little actually around what the number is, because you don't know if you've got a very flat average, so everything's a 5, or whether you've got 2s and 8s. You don't know anything about the shape of that data. So the only way around that, so this is obviously a little cartoon joke about the flow of averages, the average 3 foot deep and he's fallen into a hole, but I think that's a really good metaphor for cybersecurity. So the only way around that is to look at the range of data, maybe to publish the range and say, the average is, but the full range is this, so that's just a way of communicating that. The other thing to do is to make the categories smaller. So, like Linux machines on their own, Windows machines on their own. So the average on a Linux machine, the average on a Windows machine, maybe the criticals and highs, dividing up the problem into smaller chunks. Then your averages are not a bad proxy for where you're at. But if you've got a mixed bag of stuff, then your averages there's a thing called a Simpson's paradox. It's a mathematical thing. And if you can actually have an improving stat while the underlying data is getting worse, and it's all down to this kind of average, the effect of it. I can't do it justice in a few minutes, but it is a known phenomenon in mathematics. If you mix loads of different data types and then you try to average them and do things with them, just the fuzziness of all that data, because it's not properly structured, so it's not really sensible to average apples and oranges because they're not actually the same thing. So you have to kind of organize your data and then you can use the technique. That's just the point I'll leave you with. There's a really good slide, and I just mentioned it because I think it was so useful to me. So I'm not very creative. I'm very mathematical, but not very creative at all. And I really struggle with dashboards. But there's a really good system called ICCOR, which is Inform, Compare, Change, Organize Relationships. And I won't spend any more time than just to mention it. But there's a really good infographic from a company called Vengage. And you go and look up their website, Vengage, and they've got this lovely infographic, and it basically tells you what the right chart is to illustrate the data you're trying to do. So, if you're trying to compare two things, like trends over time or something, or changes over time, and compare maybe Linux with Windows or something, it'll tell you the right graph to use. So I won't spend time on it, but I think it's really worth mentioning if you're trying to develop a visual communications, then this is a really good formula to get used to. And, a lot of things are about relationships between different parts of the organization and different parts of the system. So kind of getting into the meat of it, given we have 5 or 10 minutes left. So this is what I would call a metrics model. And again, it's more just for illustration than, kind of a firm kind of final definition of what would be good for you. But it's got, what I like to do is I like to consider the NIST kind of model. And the reason for that is so you don't put all your metrics in the protect side of things. You want to spread, look at your holistic system. You don't just want to report on protect, all the defenses, and then forget, for example, the recovery, as I spoke about before. The board is probably more interested in your data recoverability than they are in all your nice firewalls and stuff that you spend 80% of your time on. It's kind of weird just the way it flips when you get there. But some things are just more relatable than others, is my experience. So phishing, training, phishing awareness, training, kind of user behaviors. The board will engage with that because they kind of get it. When you start talking about, various forms of MFA kind of configuration, you kind of see them glazing over. At the end of the day, we just need to kind of talk in plain English and try to, again, I just use the graph. I said, don't worry about why I specifically spoke about, kind of one particular type of MFA I'm trying to deploy. That's not really the point. The point is it getting out there or is it not? That's what you're here to help me with. You're relying on mine and the technical team's expertise to choose this. What you need to know is we're getting it out there, we're getting it implemented. So I do a couple of tricks to help. So I always pick a critical few, what I call a critical few metric. So you'll see this in an example dashboard in a minute. So there's always a sub-measurement. So let's say vulnerabilities. So we have vulnerabilities as the big measurement, and then the sub-measurement will be critical vulnerabilities. So I'm measuring the vital thing, the thing that will really knock us over. I want to measure the big picture because that's kind of the effort and the general ecosystem. Is it moving forward? Is the oil tanker going that way? But what we really want to worry about is these couple of things that really knock us over if they go wrong. And that then gets that engagement of saying, okay, I can see a big number, I can see a small number, and I always put that in red. I always put the critical metric in red, you'll see it in a minute. So that's really useful, and it kind of draws attention to that one specific thing. And over time that might change. So for example, if I'm rolling out MFA this month, I might have an MFA metric, but in 6 months' time, I might swap that out for privileged account control or something like that. You can kind of swap them up, because what you'll find with metrics is you'll publish a metric and it's magic. You publish this metric and all of a sudden it starts improving and you haven't said anything yet. It is genuinely amazing. I can tell you the amount of times I've just published a report, and because now the CEO has seen this metric, all of a sudden team goes, you know what, we better fix that. So without saying a thing, you suddenly start driving behaviors, because it's now what gets measured, gets managed. So you can really use this, but I wouldn't surprise anyone with the metric. The no surprises rule of good working with your colleagues, because you're not trying to catch them out. You're trying to work with them, and you're just saying, as of next month, I'm going to be measuring this, and here's your preliminary numbers to give you a heads up as to where we're starting. And some people complain that the numbers are quite low, and I was like, but that means your trend will be really good when you start working on it. So there's good and bad. If you're too good on the way in, you actually don't get the lift. You can only go down, right, if you're really good. If you're quite bad, you're like, okay, we've done a bit of work, we've acknowledged the problem, we're really down there, and all of a sudden the board sees it go up. So low numbers are not bad news. They're actually good news in my mind, because it means we can show a really strong trend of improvement once we put our mind to it. So don't see the numbers as good or bad, they just are what they are. It's about the journey with them. There will come a time the board will get bored of your numbers. If they're going to see green every week, so what, right, okay. They'll just literally take you off the agenda. Okay, if you're just going to tell us everything's okay, why are you speaking for 5 minutes? So I always have, so what I do, phase 1 is just measuring the numbers. They're always so bad that there's always improvement. Phase 2 is more about the 5 that are going up and the 5 that are going down. So that's how I switch it up. So, I start talking about, okay, these are the risers and these are the fallers. And then now you've got a movement story. Okay, and this is what, the most important thing is, of course, why they're moving. Why is it going up? Why is it going down? And then you can tell the story around that. So that's the way I switch it up. So after 6 months or a year, your numbers will stabilize, and then you switch it up. And you can use these vital few to get there. The other thing I'll just kind of mention for a minute is you can't just do one-dimensional measurements. So if you think about trying to describe a system, you would say, if you were Einstein's theory of dimensions, you have, at least 3 dimensions: height, width, and depth. So defense and depth is your depth. You have your height, which is maybe how effective your control is, how big a bar have you to jump over. And you have width in that, how much coverage does it get? So I worked in a company where we had, I think it was 100 critical vulnerabilities, and I thought, that's not a terrible start. And then I realized we had 1 Qualys agent deployed. So that was 100 critical issues on 1 server. When we deployed the other 300 agents, you can imagine the sheet that I looked at. So, you have to be really careful what you're looking at, because you might only be measuring half your estate, or you might be only measuring a small corner of it. So the coverage is really, really important. I would say without failure, I was an interim CISO, so moving around, I would have never seen a company with more than 70% coverage when it started, because they weren't measuring it, and it's so easy for it to fall off. So measuring your coverage, measuring your effectiveness. Timeliness is a really interesting one. If you're into Einstein's theory, is the 4th dimension, time. And actually time is really, really important in security, because obviously, like if you think about the incident response, the quicker you can respond, the more you can put out the fire. So actually timeliness is really important to kind of addressing things, and it's not something we measure enough. We generally talk about SLAs and stuff, but timeliness is pretty much in every metric you can imagine. So sometimes, like because we're using computers, we've got the benefit of real-time response. Like, so our antivirus kicks in virtually in real time, right? So there's a lot of real-time responses in there. But for example, if you're measuring your SOX time to respond, what I had in a company is the logs were collected every 30 minutes, and they had an average response time of 1 hour. They'll say, oh, we're within our golden hour. And it's like, yeah, but we've just lost half an hour to the log collector. So the timeliness, depends on where you start measuring the time. Are you measuring it from the time that the ticket gets raised, or are you measuring it from the time the incident occurred? It occurs more relevant, right? So, those are the kind of things that you just have to think about. There's no right answer. You can work on it and improve it. So I'm not going to kind of go through everyone, but you get the concept, I think, of how to build it out. I just encourage, kind of a broad list of things. I think these can just come from NIST, ISO as a starter for 10, whatever you're working with. And then just think about the coverage, effectiveness, and timeliness, and you can build out quite a good metrics model pretty simply. I'll just quickly, obviously I'm in financial services, so 3 lines of defense. There's a thing called summary metrics, and it really suffers from, as soon as you summarize something, you lose a lot of the nuances. And as technical people, or certainly I struggled as technical people, I've found, I was really uncomfortable with summary metrics. But what about this and what about that? I've lost all that, right? But there's still good kind of broad, it's a bit like if you're on a fitness training program. Are you broadly getting fitter or are you not, right? It's quite important, like a general indicator. You might be not running as fast if you're into running 10Ks or whatever. You might be running a little slower or whatever, but you're feeling good, right? So, there are other benefits, softer benefits to doing stuff. So summary metrics are really good. I think it's really good, important to categorize them and to really think about probably kind of performance indicators in the first line and risk indicators for the second line. They're really good. And what internal audit love is benchmarks. If you can show you're benchmarking against something, they seem to like that. So that's, the kind of model that you might see. And the risk indicators are really interesting because there's always that bit of lag time before the performance kicks in and resolves the risk. So you still have to measure that, even if it's, so for example, like patching within 14 days, there's a 14-day window of risk, right? So it's not a bad thing. We're not trying to get to zero. We're just trying to measure it, see how well we're doing. And then this is kind of like how I did a strategic roadmap. So you can use qualitative and quantitative. So it's not one or the other. You can use either or both, I would encourage, to use them together to kind of couple things. So, your traditional kind of risk target, you have a risk over here and you want to bring it down to there, right? That's a very traditional thing. But you can also set up some metric targets as well to kind of represent a similar thing. So it's not kind of one or the other. It's just about trying to use all the tools in the toolbox that will help you. This is kind of like what a metrics roadmap might look like. So I suggest starting with something like 8 to 12 metrics. Just kind of get used to metrics, get used to people seeing them, working with them, get used to measuring them, get your APIs working if you can. To do it, you could just get a spreadsheet out and type them up every first of the month, right? That's fine for now. Just kind of getting the ball rolling, identifying the key things, having the quick wins. It's still good. You're trying to kind of build this culture of it. Over here, you're getting into those nuances of coverage, of effectiveness, of timeliness. So you're trying to kind of get a bit smarter. You're trying to cluster maybe by Windows and Linux. So if you're using, the way I do it is I look at the tool that's like for patching, like I look at the patch deployment tool, and if you have 2 different tools, I'll have 2 different categories because I want to measure the individual tools. If I mix them, I lose the nuance which tool is doing well or not because of that law of averages thing. And these top movers is a kind of good thing to think about. And once you've kind of built that up and you've got, kind of the useful many and the vital few concept going, then you can start to do things like cyber risk quantification. And I'm a BSO, so what I'm doing is I'm basically filtering out the metrics and giving each business unit its own metrics dashboard. What I found is they're not that interested in the whole company, funnily enough. If I go and talk to CFO, they're like, okay, well, what does that mean to me? Right? Everyone wants to know what the data means to them, right? So you have to kind of segment it by their function. So it's really easy to do for phishing stuff. So what we do is we do table joins with Active Directory. The Active Directory has the whole organizational structure in it. So as soon as I do the phishing clicks, I then cross-reference the email address from there with the Active Directory, and now I've got a nice little department filter. What department are you in? Bing. Okay, you're in this function, you're in this department, and I can go up and down that list all day long and give them a whole bunch of metrics around how they're doing. So anything that's got an email address in it, I can now do it by business unit. What I've then done is I've worked out for all the applications who are the main business users to use them. I got the CMD be updated with all the department names to match Active Directory. So the Active Directory list of departments is now a drop down in the CMDB. They now select the department, and now I've got a whole list of application risks that are now by department and function. It's not perfect because not one department uses the system, there's a whole bunch of stuff, but we're getting there, you know. So so we can build this. It takes maybe 3 years to build it. So I've talked to other people, like at Vodafone and Comcast and that, they've all taken about 3 years to build this kind of proper kind of reporting system. It's not an overnight thing, but you know, so you're kind of looking at those kind of advanced capabilities down below. And then if you're a PhD research student, you can jump on with your kind of game theory and all these other risk models that you can plug in at the end and try to, you know, do exciting things. That's it for me. I think I've broadly on time.
Thank you very much, Paul. Before we go out to the remaining people for questions, do we have any in-house questions, please?
Got one. I mean, you've showed NIST there. Have you got any sort of preference over using NIST versus ISO 27004 or any of those sort of things?
No, we just internally happen to use NIST as our benchmark, but it's a purely subjective thing. We are also doing ISO certification at the moment. Take your pick. I don't think it. I find the new ISO is much better organized. Before it was a bit of a mess, really difficult to present. What you'll find is as you're trying to summarize, you need clusters together. And what NIST does very well is it clusters them in. And I think a lot of boards have got used to NIST now and they kind of get it. So I just find NIST is a little bit more digestible, but nothing against ISO. The ISO has improved greatly under the 2022 setup, so it's much more usable now. But NIST is free and public and so on. But yeah, it's a good question. Thank you.
Yeah, so you said that 3.4 is roughly the kind of point that the industry's at across financial markets. In the last 5 to 10 years, what would you say, can you speak to the movement of that? Is it where it's been and how it's moved over that time?
Well, literally, again, there's very limited research because if you want to pay the big four consultancies, you know, £10,000, they'll tell you about. So, and we did do a bit of work with them, and they revealed some of the numbers, but there's been almost no numbers. It's floated somewhere between 3.2 and 3.4.
Paul, 10 years ago, it's 3.2.
Roughly, yeah, like it's floated in that kind of level. It depends on. So what a lot of people do is they take all the NIST, controls. They take your score and they divide them by the number of questions. Let's just think about that for a minute. It's back to this averages problem again. There's no weighting in there. So you could have, some kind of minor compliance question is getting equal weighting to maybe multi-factor authentication. So the score itself doesn't actually kind of help you really, but as a broad indication of where we're at and how far we're moving, we're not winning the battle, as it were. We're not losing it either, but we're largely spending a lot of money to stand still, because if you look at cybersecurity budgets, they've gone up 10% every year compounded for the last 10 years. So we're essentially paying a lot of money to stand still. If you want to look at it that way, I don't think that's any of these numbers truly reflect all the complexities of what's behind them, but as a broad, and this is about the summary metric, like what is that summary metric that's going to tell the board you're good enough? Mm-hmm. Like that's really what like, Paul, you've got a 2-minute slot there, cut to the chase, are we good enough or not? Oh, well, it's a difficult problem. There's lots of aspects to it.
Sorry, just one follow-on, please. So as you see these metrics, do you get pushed on terms of like the efficiency of the budget against what's being achieved? And are you able to look back and kind of think, okay, here are areas where we can optimize?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I've been in a couple of companies, not my current one, it's got a great, amazing security budget, but I've been in smaller consultancies which, would just shave off a leg just to save a bit of money, right? They really are, aggressive cost cutters. And one company was in financial trouble, so it was very aggressive. So for example, one of the things we looked at was like, do we need to do pen testing every year? That was the challenge I got. And I said, well, actually, we're pen testing these things religiously every 12 months, But if we did them every 18 months, you literally knock 50% off your budget. Now, if you're going to run out of money and go bust, well, you're better to save the company and, you know, live to fight another day than it is to do a little pen testing. So you have to make some tough decisions. You see a lot of people move to Microsoft as a platform because then it's all in one and you're paying the license and you're getting it all, you know, so those are the kind of decisions you have to make. But yeah, I mean, there are companies in different cycles, yeah, for sure. Some are, you know, losing money and they want to save money everywhere. So I've had to, in a couple of cases, you know, we had to be lean about what we did and we had to pick those vital few. Like we really had to pick our controls carefully. And that's where your metrics and numbers are really helpful. Because you can say, well, okay, I'm not willing to, they wanted me to downgrade the stock. I'm not willing to compromise that. It's my only eyes and ears on it. And I know we can do 50 grand cheaper over there, but it's just not worth it, right? So you know, you have to defend your position, as it were. And yeah, you will come under pressure to find saving, sure. But in most cases, certainly in the bigger companies, generally speaking, lucky for a number of years, cybersecurity is on the way, budget's on the way up. So generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, I would say 5 to 10% of the IT budget is a good measure. So if you're regulated, you're probably towards the 10. If you're more unregulated, you're probably down towards the 5. So somewhere in there is a good, if you're looking for a benchmark.
Thank you.
So also worth looking at the effect on other things like cyber insurance, because showing stats to your insurance broker makes a huge difference on your premium. We've seen that premium going 10% year on year for the past 3 years, just showing the right level of stats. So just finding other ways of showing value through presenting stats in a different way.
Yeah, and I've been looking for research data with cyber insurance companies, given what I'm doing. Actually, they're notoriously reluctant to share because obviously this is their intellectual property, this is their, you know, clever underwriting conditions. But I think we will get to a stage where we have more structured data and better structured data about cyber risk and risk postures. And actually, the insurance companies have some of the best information. And there's a whole bunch of taxonomy that's been worked on by Cambridge University that's then fed into Lloyd's of London, which then kind of what it's doing is it's controlling how they record these incidents, because one of the issues is like, if you record an incident as ransomware, okay, great, but it doesn't tell you how they got in, right? It only tells you about the outcome of the incident, it doesn't tell you anything about the attack vector. So we have to kind of try to think about how we record this information, how we communicate this information. So even if you look at things like the Orange cybersecurity, I read all these industry reports just for fun, but they, you know, mix up outcomes with attack vectors all the time. I'm sitting there, obviously being a bit of a kind of research nerd, you know, saying, okay, you've completely mixed your language there. You're talking about outcomes on one hand, but you're also interspersing it with attack vectors. We need to get clear as an industry about that. We're doing ourselves a disservice. It's not a criticism of them. It's just we're so used to talking about the same things interchangeably. We actually haven't really considered what we're actually talking about. So obviously we got the VERS standard, which is trying to kind of help with that and so on. But there's been a whole bunch of work around taxonomy, is like how the language of cybersecurity and how we record things is really important, because that drives the research, which then drives the, you know, the outcomes. And again, if you come back to quantification and metrics, we need good structured data. You know, if you have a car accident, they're meticulous about how they record that. And then they can underwrite premiums, you know, with a 5% margin, because they literally can get that fine, you know, to the wire. You know, cyber insurers, you know, they're either losing tons of money or they're making tons of money. They can't, you know, they want to get it right. They're actually not that keen to, you know, they want to be kind of sustainable over time. They don't really want this boom and bust thing going on. That's not good for an insurance company. What an insurance company wants is predictable risk over time. So, yeah. So they, you know, the metrics and the measurements are really important.
Emmanuel, are you still online?
Yeah, I'm still here. I've got, I think one question that one of the delegates want to know. Basically, most of them have enjoyed the program. They've been thanking Paul for the great work he's done. But the question that has been asked is, one second. I think the question is not appearing anymore. One of the delegates, yeah, answer, it's no longer here. I don't know whether it's been deleted. If anyone can, if you can type it again, that'd be very good. Rajiv, yeah, I think the question is no. Rajiv, if you are still online, you can still type your question. What you wanted to find out when you said, okay, let me see if it's here now. So Rajiv, if you are still online, you can type your question again. I can now see really interesting, but it used to be question. So maybe if it's been answered and it's been deleted, that's fine. So
While he's writing out his question, if anyone's got any more, then yep.
You mentioned DORA metrics,
Yeah.
which has sort of got reputation's grown. The amount of the evidence for them is kind of very slim. They started off with some based on a survey, and the metrics changed a lot. Why did you particularly choose DORA?
Well, I didn't. I suppose I wouldn't say I had chosen Dora. I think Dora chose us. But but what I'm trying to drive is kind of automation of measurement. Really, that's what I'm trying to drive as a culture, and therefore Dora is new. So it's an opportunity to develop something from the get-go. You know, that we literally have a automated dashboard that gives the people who need to report around the control postures. We're not going to be able to automate everything, but we are really going for the 80-20 rule quite quickly and trying to move it on upwards from there. So I guess it's new, but obviously, as you know, the DORA stuff is evolving. Like, what do all these things mean? Because they write out all this regulation, and then people have to interpret what they mean and come up with what good looks like, and people have different opinions on that. So, but I think. What I wish the world would do, and my call in my research is, we need to stop fragmenting the whole problem. Like, there's only one IT system, like one IT, there's only a series of IT systems. They've got authentication, configuration, vulnerability. Like, how many questions do we need to ask, and how many different ways do we need to ask them? Like, we need to get to, if you look at financial services, finance, they've got international accounting standards, because companies are no longer national, they're international. Like, there's almost no, every IT company is international. There's no regional really companies or any size or shape. So like, we need to solve this problem in the sense that we're burning so much of our resources filling out these compliance things that it's just not a good use of time. It adds value in the sense if you're really rubbish, you probably spot that. But if you're in this intermediate level, it actually doesn't help at all. And there's a lot of, in my personal view, when I look at the data, there's a lot of conflict between compliance and security. So, good compliance is not good security. So actually the compliance is kind of dragging people over here, and the security team is trying to drag people over here. And they're actually just ending up with all this tension arising between them. Well, all that's just wasted resources and meetings that could be better put into coming up with a better security posture. So I think, there'll be, like, America's just passed a law about the harmonization of laws across America for all the federal stuff. And, that's the best news ever, because what they're trying to say is, look, there's a burden of administration here that's just too much. And one of the things I did is I looked at all the recent cyber risk events that happened in the world. So at the time it was Uber, and I'm just trying to think of who it was, and a few others. I said, in our third-party questionnaire, would we have asked the question that caused that incident? Did we ask that question? I couldn't find a single question that we had asked that actually would have addressed any of those incidents at all. And that wasn't because we had a bad questionnaire. And I used to sit on the other side of Barclays, who have a lovely habit of, no offense Barclays, but you're sending 800 questionnaires. And I looked at their question there, and he didn't ask it either. So like, these questionnaires, I'm not saying they're completely pointless, but it's this vital few theory. There's actually only about 10 or 15 questions that really matter. Like, basically, are you really rubbish at cyber security? You can't ask it like that. But that's essentially the proxy of the next 10 questions is, like, have you done these basics? And if you've done the basics and you've got a SOC 2 certification, whatever, you can ask 100 more questions. I'm not sure you're going to learn a lot more. So there's a really interesting piece of research at A&E about how many questions you ask someone who comes in with a heart condition. And they worked out there was 6 questions that meant they would die in the next 40 minutes. So they got back, we spent an hour triaging them, then now they're spending 10 minutes. So they got back 50 minutes to invest in taking care of that patient. So there's, I'm not saying there's an easy answer, but I'm saying there is probably an efficiency answer because it frees up resources to actually work on the root problem. But we're not going to get there for the next 5 or 10 years. But we have to keep looking at the efficiency, which is we do things. Otherwise, we miss the point. You know, we want to be efficient and effective, like not just effective, but efficient too. Like that matters, especially as you scale.
Can I ask another question if you don't mind?
Yeah, we have one remote question, so I don't know whether I can
Let
speak
them go
that.
first. Yeah, go ahead, Aman.
Okay, Sham Surani asks, he said, how would evolving AI and changes in threat landscape due to that impact security and your research on your cyber metrics in particular?
Thank you.
I-
Great
I-
question. So we're asking about AI and its impact on metrics and cyber risk in general. Yeah, we couldn't go an evening without talking about AI, could we? It's so I'm doing I'm writing a book at the moment, and it's about systemic risk, and the category that I put AI on in is called amplification. So AI in itself is not a risk. AI can't do anything that you can't do slowly manually. If you think about it, like it can only do it faster and more smarter, right? So really it's not, I wouldn't say it's a risk in itself, but what it does is it amplifies other risks that exist. So if you want to, you know, kind of do a web attack, you know, your AI bot can super, accelerate that attack, it can be much smarter, more responsive, do a lot of research for it, you know, like really help you in that. But you're still attacking it with the same, you know, it might find a new technique from someone else, but someone else probably discovered that. Because remember, all AI is at the moment is language learning models, so all it can do is be as smart as the other smartest person in the room, if it can get access to it. So, yeah, so the AI thing, I think, is a bit of a red herring when it comes to it. But what I would suggest is, I was, funny enough, I was programming all these API interfaces, and there was a bug in one, and I used the Copilot to basically debug the code, and it did it, and it wasn't anywhere in Microsoft's documentation, and we'd already logged a ticket at Microsoft, and they came back, and they said, oh, you've already solved it. I said, yeah, Copilot gave us the answers, and when we look at your documentation, there is no answers there, but Copilot, for some reason, had the answer. So, like, there is huge advantages on both sides. So what I would say is, you know, for data analysis and, you know, data mining, get in there, you know, start using it to defend as well as, you know, be subject to the attacks. But I don't think it can, if you've got bad data, you're going to get bad answers. So you still have to do the basics and then it will enhance it. But if you've got rubbish data, then AI is just going to throw up a load of rubbish answers because all it's doing is analysing what you've got anyway. So that's my view on AI. It's a great tool for accelerating things, but you've got to get the basics right. Otherwise, you're just accelerating rubbish.
Can you hold your question until we go next door?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no problem.
Emmanuel, thank you very much for your help. We're going to go and get some refreshments now.
Okay,
Thank
okay.
Paul
So
for his presentation.
okay.
Okay, Paul, thank you very much. It's been very illuminating. Probably raised more questions. It's always a good thing in IT. Thanks very much.